Welcome everybody, I'm Liam from PCPSI and I'm delighted tonight to be joined by Dr. Laurence. Welcome, Larry.
It's nice to be here. Thank you, Liam.
And we're very privileged to have Dr. Heller tonight, and even more privileged to have Larry coming on the 7th and 8th of March to Cork, Ireland. So that's great. And for those of you that don't know, Larry has wrote this book, Healing Developmental Trauma, with Aline Lepere. And for anybody that hasn't read it, please do, because it's a fantastic read and it really captures the essence of developmental trauma. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you tonight, Larry, because yeah. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time.
Thank you.
And your work has really helped me on a personal level and a professional level. And I remember you talking at some, I think it was a webinar, and you were talking about the connection survival style.
Correct, yes.
And that would be a style that I would be very personal to me.
Mm.
And I heard you using the metaphor of a feral animal that has been in the wild for a long time and has this huge desire to come in, but is really terrified as well. And you talked about how would you work with something like that? And you explained it beautiful, and you talked about an invitational space. And I really kind of thought afterwards, this guy knows what he's talking about.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So
it's interesting because in terms of feedback about the book, I've gotten lots of very gratifying feedback, and probably a big percentage of the people who've written me were from people who identified with the connection survival style and shared with me that they felt understood really for the first time in many cases. So
absolutely.
It's very gratifying for me, obviously.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's really, you hit the nail in the head how to work with that style and how that style can so easily be kind of shamed in therapy. And I think you talk about how it's the style, I think, that those of us that are therapists maybe have the most difficulty working with. Yeah. So it's really great. So maybe to start, where in the world are you, Larry?
Well, right now I'm in where I live, which is Los Angeles, California. And but as you know, I'm regularly back and forth in Europe. I've taught a number of times, both in Cork and in different places in Ireland, and I have a very special connection to Ireland. So I'm very much looking forward to coming again in March and presenting.
Great.
Yeah. So right now in Los Angeles, this is kind of my downtime in the States, in several months off between trips. But I'll be starting again in March, actually. And Ireland is my first stop this time.
Nice. Yeah. Nice. Great. And maybe to start, Larry, just maybe for people that are not familiar with your work, maybe if you just give a bit of background of your own history. Like, I know one of the things that you've taught, and I still think you do teach, for the SomaticExperiencing Institute.
I used to. Yeah, I'm still theoretically on the faculty there, but I haven't taught somatic experiencing for quite some time.
Okay.
But I still respect that work very much as a very powerful shock trauma method, and I make an important distinction, as you and I were chatting about earlier before the recording, about this important distinction between working with shock trauma and developmental trauma and the different requirements of that. So, yeah, somatic experiencing has certainly been an important part of my background. Many other therapies. I've always been a body-oriented therapist, although I had a traditional psychodynamic training in various kinds of psychodynamic approaches, object relations and ego psychology and other things. But I've always been aware of the importance of the body in working with trauma and being able to at least to reference the body in some ways. And it's not just cognitive or, that kind of therapy. It's much more visceral and experiential. So drawing on many different elements, body work, energy work, psychological work, really partly for my own development personally. That was like so many therapists, guys,
Yeah.
what originally got me into,
Mm.
pursuing some of these different methods. And, I've been a clinician now for 45 years, so I've been around and seen things change. And yeah, so all of a sudden you disappeared and my name came up on the screen. I'm hoping that everything's okay there.
Okay. Okay. I can
Oh,
see. I can still see you and hear you, Anya. So that's
okay. Very good. Very good.
and like one of the things that we're very interested in here in PCPSI is the difference of working with developmental trauma versus shock trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mhm.
Could you maybe start and talk about what you see the main differences are?
Certainly. I think that when we're working really singularly with a shock trauma piece, that's more a brainstem response. It's really an instinctive response. As clearly you're familiar with somatic experiencing that works with complete biological completion of the fight-flight response, and that enables people to come out of freeze. So you can, at least theoretically, work with shock trauma primarily from a bottom-up perspective, re-regulating the nervous system and so on. But with developmental trauma, there are other elements that we need to pay close attention to, because it's not just a brainstem response. It involves all levels of the brain and the body, and and we need to address the way that not just self-regulation gets affected by trauma. Self-regulation gets affected by both developmental and shock trauma in a negative way usually, but also the distortion of identity that creates this kind of vicious cycle for people where the identity gets distorted in adapting to, particularly to early developmental trauma. Basically, I can simplify how that happens, which is that a child cannot experience him or herself as a good person in a bad situation. So the earliest development of who we take ourselves to be is really a reflection of the environment that we grow up in. And so if we grow up in a more benign environment, we tend to have a more positive self-image. And if we grow up in a very difficult environment which can be from a variety of causes, we as children tend to take that on and continue. And we'll get to in the course of this webinar some of the particularly important elements, such as the splitting that the child does to protect the attachment relationship, also by making themselves the bad one. There's an adaptive mechanism in there, and we need to address both the regulation piece, or the dysregulation piece, as well as the distortions of identity, which include self-rejection, self-hatred, self-judgment, shame, toxic shame, so those are the elements that we need to address directly. And interesting, part of my journey is like this book was published in 2012. The bulk of the writing was in 2010, and then later the CPTSD, the complex PTSD diagnosis came out.
Yeah.
And it was pointed out to me, I didn't realize it at first myself, it was pointed out to me by somebody else, that the three elements that I put on the title of the book, self-regulation, self-image, and the capacity for relationship, became the standards for complex PTSD, which is what is being used these days in addition to developmental trauma, so complex trauma.
Okay. Amazing. So it's better to be a bad child with good parents than a good child with bad parents.
Absolutely, because if we look at it from a child's perspective, if we, for example, believe that we are, that our parents don't have the capacity to love us in the way that we need to, from a child's perspective or experience, that means there's really no love in the universe. But if we blame ourselves for that and take the blame and the responsibility for whatever is whatever the environmental failures that we experience are,
Mm.
then there's hope. We can make ourselves better and win love. And so many of the adaptations that we make as human beings or as children growing up have to do with developing strategies and survival styles, which are ultimately designed
Mm.
to win love. But of course, they're developed through a child's perspective at a very early and vulnerable point of life, and they do save us. They're real in that sense, but then the very mechanisms that protect us as children end up creating symptoms for us as we grow older and become adults.
Okay. And I know in the book, Larry, you talk about 5 main adaptations.
Exactly.
So maybe, and I know there's quite a depth to each adaptation, but maybe if you just, for people that are not familiar with them, could you give us a brief overview of the 5 different survival styles?
Certainly. One of the things too, as a kind of a framework, is that it's helpful, I think, to understand that more or less the psychological symptoms that we experience as human beings and many of the physiological symptoms that we experience as human beings can be reduced to one or more of these 5 organizing principles, these survival styles. And each one of these survival styles develops using some kind of form of disconnection. So like the connection survival style disconnects from the body, disconnects from emotions often disconnects from other people. So is emotionally withdrawn from other people. And that it's the first survival style, and it's a primary adaptation where there's the connection or the disconnection is the strongest in this particular area. But then as we go through the other 4, the second and these are developmental and also held in the body, all of these elements at the same time. And so the second survival style is what I call the attunement survival style. And each one of the survival styles is named for the missing or compromised capacity, the capacity that gets disconnected from. So it's paradoxical in the sense of, as I teach this attunement survival style, in the sense that individuals who are stuck primarily in the attunement survival style are often at least exquisitely attuned to other people's needs, and often profoundly misattuned to their own. And as a matter of fact, then they develop a certain identity around, we develop a certain identity around denying our needs and being there for other people's, and then we grow up to be therapists and nurses and social workers and people, who focus and specialize in being attuned to other people's needs. And we develop capacities, of course, but at the expense sometimes of our own needs. So it isn't that we have to give up being attuned to other people's needs, but it's also very helpful, and in order to, it's helpful to be able to attune to our own needs as well. So then the third survival style, the missing or compromised capacity, is trust. And in a very particular kind of way, this is where children often in some way feel used or betrayed by the parents, or at least by the early environment. And they internalize that. And at the same time, they're often rewarded so that they give up themselves as part of this betrayal, and then they're rewarded for doing so. And I'll give an example because that might be a little vague for people, but I'll use a couple of kind of classic examples. The child who is enlisted to make up for the parent's life in a certain way. So for example, it could be that the parent was a failed football player or a failed ballerina, and then they enlist their child to live out the life that they were never able to live out. So the child looks like they're being cared for, and on one level, and then, but at the same time, they're being rewarded. It isn't necessarily what they want for themselves.
Okay.
So it's very confusing. Now, this survival style has a wide spectrum. It also you can develop this survival style when you grow up around violence. This is the more extreme end of the spectrum, where, and you know, so this can be violence in the family. It could be violence in the culture or in the place that you grow up in. There's this sense that you can't trust anybody but yourself. And so that it creates a kind of isolation and really in more extreme cases, a certain kind of paranoia, because if you believe that you can't trust anybody but yourself, then you're always thinking the worst about everybody around.
Absolutely.
So then the fourth survival style is what I call the autonomy survival style. And this is the survival style where the child's age appropriate autonomy was not supported, meaning that for a variety of reasons, parents can undermine the development of age appropriate autonomy in the child. So for example, it could be that there's a very anxious parent who gets anxious about the child leaving him or her. There could be the very rigid or judgmental parent who always knows what's right for the child and never lets them develop their own, their own will, for example. Mm. There are parents who still believe that it's their job to break the child's will. And that almost always leads to this autonomy survival style, because there's this dynamic where on the surface, these individuals who identify with this survival style are very sweet and pleasant and nice, but underneath there is all of this conscious or unconscious anger and desire to break free from whatever constraints that they're experiencing, but it's never expressed in a direct way. So again, at the more extreme end of the spectrum, we get this passive aggressive dynamic, where there's this superficial pleasantness, but this deep-seated, there's no way you're gonna control me kind of dynamic. Yeah. So then the last survival style is it's the only one that has two different capacities in the title, which is the love sexuality survival style. And ultimately this means being able to have a capacity for an open heart and a vital sexuality. And with this particular survival style, the issue of being able to integrate heart and sexuality comes into play a lot. And these individuals tend to be perfectionists and tend to be very, hardworking, energetic, striving, but ultimately very self-rejecting. They tend to see anything, when they look in the mirror, for example, regardless of how objectively handsome or good looking they may be or beautiful, whatever, is they tend to view the world and themselves in particular through very critical eyes. And this is again a reflection of what they grew up with. So.
Okay, so you said a lot, but I think one of the themes that goes through all the styles is the whole idea of anger. And I know in the NARM approach, the idea of healthy aggression is very important. And I think the whole idea of getting back in touch with our healthy aggression, because it seems with a lot of the survival styles that they either act in the anger or act it out. So maybe could you talk a bit about what you mean by healthy aggression and how it relates to the different survival styles?
Certainly, and you're correct in seeing that that's an organizing principle for all of the survival styles. And I'll talk about this psychobiological dynamic that we see with all of the survival styles, which is that anybody who's raised a child knows that a healthy child has, is in touch with a certain kind of healthy aggression, which is at its core simply a way of communicating to the environment. So if they're cold, before they have even language, if they're cold, there's a certain kind of cry. If they're hungry, there's a certain kind of cry. This is a protest, and anger and protest are communications to the environment at the beginning. Now when we disconnect from our anger, we don't know that. We lose touch with what it is that the anger is trying to communicate. And in the NARM approach, the whole piece of emotional completion is very important, in addition to biological completion that we see, for example, in shock trauma methods. But this emotional completion means being able to, instead of turning the anger against the self and acting in, as you mentioned, or turning it against other people and acting out, we learn to be present to this anger, to integrate the energetics and understand what it is that this unintegrated anger is trying to communicate. And we see that if, the child will have a need, if the need isn't met, there'll be protest. And if the protest isn't met, then the tendency is, at least, is the child will escalate into anger. And this anger, you see, is dangerous, is experienced as dangerous to the child for a couple of reasons. One is, depending on the environment, if the child is angry, the parents can get angrier back, and that's threatening them from the outside. But even if there isn't this outside threat, the threat of and this relates to what you and I were talking about before, the threat is that if you feel this anger, the child is unable in the early years to hold this image and to hold the emotion of being angry at the person that they're completely dependent upon and who they love at the same time. So that's where the splitting dynamic that I mentioned earlier comes in, is that they split the image of the parent into the good parent and the bad parent, and the image of themselves into the good self and the bad self. And then they turn the anger against themselves. That's a normal thing. Sometimes they'll turn it against the environment too, but this very common pattern of turning it against the self, hating themselves for the elements that they felt were not met or rejected by the environment. And that's again, so we've internalized this environmental failure. And in doing so, though, we lose touch with this aliveness that healthy aggression, once it's integrated, and that's what we do in NARM, is we help people integrate the anger that they may not even be consciously aware of, or only vaguely aware of anyway. And so that repeatedly in the clinical process, as individuals integrate anger, their lives change. They feel they have much more energy available to them. A big part of anxiety and chronic anxiety, I found in my long clinical experience, is often anger that a person has disconnected from and doesn't even realize that it's there. And we talk about anger or anxiety as a signal anxiety. It's signaling that something needs to be addressed, that they don't know consciously what that is. So as you know, and when, of course, in the seminar that I'll be doing in March, I'll be going over these dynamics in a much more concrete way, going through it step by step. But I'm trying to give you a brief, you and everybody watching, a brief overview of the process.
It sounds really good, Larry, because I think what you're saying is that kind of, say, in NARM, and if you're working with somebody, a big milestone for a client is psychologically when they own their anger. And then from a body and an energetic perspective, when they're able to experience it without acting in or acting out. And then I think this is new. I haven't heard this before. I think it's different what you're saying then as well. You're, from an NARM perspective, you're interested in what the implicit intention of the anger is.
Exactly.
So that's really new.
Yeah, because it's important for us as clinicians to remember that the emotions are not random, that there is always an implicit message in the anger, even if it's been consciously lost. And as people get in touch with the anger, that, and the intention behind the anger, all of that energy and emotion that they have been directing against themselves changes. They see that, okay, now they understand what's been going on, and it's their self-image starts to change. So they don't need to protect the attachment relationship, which is only valid from a child's perspective. Of course, the child needs to protect it, but as adults, we can hold a more integrated view of ourselves, our parents, other people, and see that we can love people and be angry at them at the same time. That's an old psychodynamic understanding that I've integrated into NARM, but it's essential in terms of human growth and development.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. Just a bit what we talked about earlier, Larry. Why do a percentage of therapists find the connection survival style difficult to work with?
Well, one of the major themes that I'll be addressing is the universal dynamic that I've discovered in teaching now in many, many different countries, and I see this in every country that I teach in, which is that one, even though therapists generally have the best intentions, they work too hard. and you know, clearly you related to and understood what I was getting at. You know, it's like, if you're working too hard to get the client to trust you, for example, if you're working too hard, if you become goal-oriented as a client, trying to just focus on symptoms, you'll miss these connection survival style individuals, because they're much more than symptoms. We always in NARM, we're holding an orientation to not just symptom relief, but what is it that's driving these symptoms? And if we just focus on, you know, symptoms and try and push clients, we'll, particularly with these more vulnerable connection survival style clients, will lose their trust. And that's where I use that metaphor of the feral animal. It's like you have to hold a welcoming and relational space, but they have to be clear, just like the feral animal, the client. Now I'm talking about the client has to be clear, like a feral animal, that you're not going to come after them, because just like that feral animal who will run away if you try and go after them, if the therapist gets too active, too helpful, too goal-oriented, they'll actually lose these clients, and the client will get scared and withdraw from them. And so we're holding this very compassionate space, but we're not trying to make anything happen for the client. We're trusting that something will happen as they trust, as they are able to come back into relationship, you know. And for many individuals with the connection survival style, their experience of human relationships has been threatening. So you may be, as the therapist, the very first kind person that the client has experienced in their lives. And part of the kindness, though, requires attunement. And that attunement is that we present this kindness, but we understand that they may be reluctant to move too close, too quickly, and we want to respect that.
Absolutely. So NARM is not big on goal orientation or solution focused, or...
Yeah, that's true. It's not. And one of the things that I mention in my teaching is that it's very hard to be solution focused if we don't know what the actual problem is. So often you see it's very strong in the therapeutic tradition, psychotherapeutic tradition, that we make the symptoms and symptom relief the focus, and then we don't get to what is it that's actually creating these symptoms. And in NARM, we look at whatever symptoms, emotional symptoms, and certainly sometimes physical symptoms, like what is it that the body and the emotions are trying to communicate to us, and what is the emotion that goes with that. And so this top-down, bottom-up method of working both with body awareness, with emotional awareness, and with awareness of, but also bringing the cognition. And so it's both a bottom-up and top-down approach. That's what I found is most helpful in working with developmental trauma.
Yeah. And you talk about that in the book as it's a bit like the distress cycle.
Well, yeah, because the distress cycle is this vicious cycle where you get, sometimes the trauma is actually pre-verbal. And, if people have very early birth trauma or prenatal trauma or early attachment trauma, all of these elements. And so even before words, they have this experience of profound distress that they experience. And then if it's very early trauma, as the psychological self develops, it develops on the shaky biological foundation of distress. And so going back to what you and I were talking about earlier, is that then when the child or the infant experiences this distress, they basically come to the conclusion as the psychological self develops that there's something wrong with them. And then they become symptomatic, and that reinforces the belief that there's something basically wrong with them. And then they experience that they're shy, and shyer than other little kids their age. And then they think, and that adds to the shame, and they think that that just confirms that there's something wrong with them. And so all of these things, all of these elements come together to create a very difficult scenario. And by the time a person is an adult and comes to us as clinicians, for example, they can often have a variety of different symptoms, and we can get lost in the symptoms if we don't understand what the organizing principles are.
Okay, brilliant. Just before we move on, anybody that has questions, please send them in. Are we using the chat function? So Larry, I think there's 4 main NARM principles. Again, could you maybe name them and give us a brief overview?
Yeah. One of the things that seems so basic, and yet I've come to understand and see, and having taught this, the approach now for quite a few years, is that many therapists don't have a clear understanding of what it is that they're doing with their clients. A very common scenario that I see with therapists is the client comes in and starts talking about certain kinds of symptoms that they've been experiencing, and then the therapist takes over the process, tries to work out a treatment plan, but they never really ask the client what it is that they wanted. And so the first step of we call them the 4 pillars of NARM, and those people in the seminar will see this in detail, how this works. But the first pillar is that first we want to get an intention from the client, what it is that they want. And we don't accept generally we don't. There are exceptions, of course, but we have things go more quickly if we don't if the intention is something more than just symptom relief. We want to know what is it that a person really wants for themselves. Ultimately, when the person is able to express some element of what their heart's desire is, that takes them underneath the symptoms. That takes them to something more authentic in them. And then we, in a non-goal oriented way, develop a contract. So the way that we work in NARM is, again, not solution focused, but exploration focused. So because we all know as therapists that we can't promise results, but what we can promise is that we'll explore what's, let's say the person is got what would be traditionally called as social phobia, and they want to be able to have more an active, be more socially engaged, let's say. So the way that we will formulate the contract is I'll explore what's getting in the way, and we're talking on an emotional level, what's getting in the way for you of having more social engagement, more social contact. So we're not taking over, we're not being social workers. I don't mean that in any bad sense. It's that, but we're looking at what we talk about in NARM as the core conflict. And the core conflict is always one form or another of wanting connection and being afraid of it. And that, you may not know this, is that the original title of the book actually was Connection, Our Deepest Desire and Greatest Fear. Okay. Now, yeah, and that emotionally, I was attached to that, but Random House, the publisher, said that wasn't Googleable, and and we needed to come up with a different title. And and I was talking about developmental trauma, and they said, well, what about just using developmental trauma as part of the title? And I think from a marketing perspective, they were correct, and so the book has done well, and I think, but this original title does sum up this core dilemma that we're working with all the time as therapists, is that people want connection and they're afraid of connection, and ultimately we want to express our needs to other human beings And we're afraid of that if we identify with the attunement survival style, or we want to set limits and say no and set boundaries to other people, with other people, but we're afraid. So all of these elements, and it's that part of what is ultimately the frightening thing about connection or expressing your needs or setting boundaries. And we see that what is most frightening is that the idea is that if I show up in a more authentic, real way with other people, that I will be rejected and not loved. If I say no to people, if I'm not the nice person and the nice guy, the nice gal all the time, then people won't love me. And so this is at the back of people's minds. Sometimes that, it's more conscious for some individuals than others, but generally they don't know where this dynamic is coming from. And this, from a NARM perspective, is always a reflection of early attachment dynamics.
Okay. And in the approach, Larry, the approach is more resource orientated, and you work more in the present time than other psychodynamic approaches?
Certainly more than other psychodynamic approaches, but I realized too that I didn't go through the other three pillars. But
yeah.
This question actually brings up the fourth pillar. The second pillar, let me just do it very briefly, is just a certain kind of inquiry that we do, which is an emotional and body-based inquiry about just exploring what are the various dynamics that are going on that are creating difficulty for this person. The third pillar has to do with what we talk about, or what I talk about as agency, which is to see that even though we didn't start these dynamics, to really take ownership for how we're carrying them forward as adults. And then the fourth pillar relates to your recent question here, which has to do with both the body piece and the way we resource in NARM, which is different than the way I used to resource, for example, when I was doing shock trauma, which is that we're always focusing on the capacities that a person has, either the capacities that they come in with, which they don't often realize, and the capacities that they develop in the course of the clinical process. And we help anchor that in bodily experience. And so it's not like we take people to a desert island or a beautiful beach, or, it's not resourcing in the way some people think about it, but it is in a very real way reflecting the capacity that a person has. And when the client gets in touch with internal resources to help make them consciously aware of that, because we all have resources really that we're not aware of. And for us to reflect that to the client is one step or one part of the process of shifting this negative self-image that, people develop in different ways, to seeing that we've done the best that we knew how to do as children growing up. And even as adults, we're doing the best that we know how to do. And so that we don't reject any of the older survival mechanisms that we used, but it helps us to move on. And that's where resourcing comes in NARM.
Okay, and it sounds very different to resourcing that you would do in SE.
Right.
Because I'm stating the obvious here, but you can't resource away these internal states.
That's exactly it. That's, you can't resource away self-hatred or self-judgment. It doesn't respond. We have to bring other elements in there. And this self-hatred and self-judgment is so much a part of developmental trauma. If it's a pure shock trauma piece, which is rare actually, most people, when they have a shock trauma, it brings up developmental trauma at the same time. So it's good to have an awareness of both methods when you're dealing with shock trauma, because developmental trauma will also present itself, as I'm sure most of the clinicians have experienced out there, like opening Pandora's box when you have a severe car accident or a bad fall, or various kinds of shock trauma elements. So
And maybe just the last question, Larry, before we go on to the questions and answers. I think NARM addresses identity different as well.
It does. It's you know, it's an interesting thing is that I hold identity to be a much more fluid process than it's traditionally understood to be.
Mm-hmm.
And we all, you know, what we have taken to be our identity is often, as I mentioned earlier, distortions from the environment that we've taken on. And so one of the things that, and this is where a mindfulness piece comes in as well, and a heartfulness piece. I like to use both expressions in NARM because mindfulness brings up a certain kind of more mental, you know, process, and it's a heart-based process as well as an awareness and a cognitive process, which is that we learn to hold what we have taken to be who we are more progressively, more lightly. And we don't, it sounds kind of unusual, but in a certain way, we take ourselves less seriously, you know, and we know that, and we take, you know, it's like in NARM, we are very emotionally oriented, but we also, there's an understanding that develops that emotions come and go. And that's part of the mindfulness and heartfulness piece. So ultimately, all of these rigid categories that are so much a part of many people's identity tend to dissolve. Mm-hmm. And often at first there can be a little bit of disorientation or it feels a little strange, but then there's a certain experience of freedom that comes for people as these old structures tend to loosen and soften in us. And that's a very, you know, it's hard in this short period to go into that. Certainly in the 2 days that we have together, I'll be talking about this different orientation to identity. That's really an important part of NARM, but I'll save some of that for the seminar.
Can you see the questions on your side, Larry, or do you want me to call them out?
I can just see that the chat button is lit up, but I can't see the individual questions.
Can you press on that and they should come up?
Oh, there we go. That's good. I have not experienced that before on other Zoom calls. Oh yeah. So the first question is, I don't know if everybody can read this or not, but it says, the person is wondering if people can have a mix of survival styles, but maybe a dominant survival style. Well, what I always teach is that everybody has elements of all of the 5 survival styles. And then we all tend to be more, you know, stuck in 1 or 2. But since these are all human issues of connection, attunement, trust, autonomy, love, sexuality, we all have some elements of all of the survival styles. So to answer your question, which is exactly right, there tends to be a dominant or sometimes a couple of dominant survival styles, but a mixture of many. So then the next question is fibromyalgia directly correlated with trauma? Can trauma therapy put a person into remission? You know, we don't have evidence-based data that confirms that, but there is a lot of clinical experience that says that some people who struggle with fibromyalgia will improve as they deal with their developmental trauma. Because if we think about the person as one, you know, as just one piece, when there's early developmental trauma, there's profound systemic dysregulation. And systemic dysregulation that's paired with, you know, identity distortion in this vicious cycle that, you know, we talked about earlier. And so that as a person heals some of their developmental wounding, there's a profound re-regulation that takes place spontaneously without even trying to re-regulate the person. The dysregulation is so much a function of disconnection, which we've all used to protect ourselves. So some people, and again, just from clinical experience, some people do find significant improvement with symptoms like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and other kind of syndromal symptoms. Oh, okay. Then no, there's the third from Rosalie. in dealing with childhood abuse, a lot of clients don't know what they want. Where do you start from there? This is going to take me a little more time. I'm going to have to demonstrate that, because it usually is a way of just asking the right kinds of questions that can help the person formulate for themselves what it is that they really want. Because you see, I make a distinction in NARM between strategies and intentions. So for example, the person will think that their intention is to come in and explore such and such. Well, exploration, as noble as that sounds, and as much a part of NARM as it is, exploration is a strategy. There's a hope that something will come out of that exploration. And in getting to the intention, we want to ask, well, okay, exploration is a very useful thing that we will do together, but what is it that you hope will come out of that exploration? Now that's a more obvious one. Often it's the intention is much more hidden, and the more early trauma a person experiences, often the harder it is for them to formulate an intention. So actually clarifying and helping the client to formulate their own intention is actually also part of the therapeutic process. That's why it's the first pillar. So again, I can't be much more specific in the short time that I have, but those people who come to the seminar will see me doing some live demos and video demos where that process will get clearer for people, I would say. Okay. And then, would you see any of the changes regarding identity becoming more fluid as, say, relate to transferable to the field of LGBT and identity? Well, this is obviously a question that's more and more on people's minds. And I think in NARM, one of the very gratifying and common elements or pieces of feedback that I get and that other NARM therapists get from their clients is that as we work through our own unresolved developmental trauma, we become increasingly, as adults, we become increasingly less dependent on the environmental response for our own sense of well-being. And of course, people who've experienced systemic and discrimination of all kinds, including the population in this question, come to a certain kind of compassion and acceptance, and as they work through the distortions of the mirroring that they have gotten, maybe in their family, maybe in their culture, maybe a combination of those kinds of things, and become increasingly more independent for their own sense of self and less dependent on society or what other people may think. So that's hopefully in brief a question, or an answer to that question. So then the next question that I'm reading is, can a foster child who experienced trauma after birth act out with bad behavior by age of 6? How to deal with it? We know that they can, of course, because and it depends so much on what went into the foster process, of course. We know that long periods, for example, in foster care, children tend, and sometimes being sent to multiple foster homes. Well, this, of course, has a profound impact on the child's attachment, capacity, and they're already in distress even before the age of 6. So they may be, symptomatic in a variety of ways. They may act in, they may act out, they may do both, but certainly by the age of 6, we'll see that some children are symptomatic. Now, the last part of the question is how to deal with it. That I would have to have more specific details, like to know the details of any given situation, because even though there are some commonalities, every child is different, every child's situation is different. It's hard for me to generalize about how I would deal with it, but that is something that if I could understand more of the given, the dynamics of a situation, that I could give more specific kind of input about. And then, the last.
There's actually three more questions after coming in on a different medium. Larry, are you okay to answer them?
Of course. I just can't see them, so will you read them?
Sure.
Okay.
From James, can you educate us somewhat on where bipolar fits into the NARM model? Thank you. This is very helpful and affirming.
Okay. Well, it gets into tricky territory, because the common understanding is that bipolar is purely biological, and there may very well be biological elements to, again, we're talking about a lot of different people who've been diagnosed as bipolar, but in any case, without getting into the argument of whether it's how much it's biological, to what degree it's biological, to what degree is it developmental and emotional, is that as people do their own personal work, the many things, again, the systemic dysregulation that I talked about, can be experienced by some people with very high, with ups and downs, and it may mimic bipolar or may even have elements of bipolarity to it. So it's certainly, I don't recommend that people give up their medication, but I do recommend that if a person has been diagnosed as bipolar, that personal work in any good model will be helpful. And if there happens to be a NARM therapist near where you are, then I would recommend that, of course. But so again, I think that it's a combination. We're often looking at a combination of both nature, nurture, and epigenetic, and other kinds of dynamics. So there's a complexity here.
Okay. So next question is for Jocelyn. In an encounter where you are seeing someone in an emergency department and they have experienced a trauma and are presenting with suicidal ideation or behaviors, how do you avoid re-traumatizing them? Helpful strategies.
Oh, again, it's such a big question, and I mean, there's so many elements to that question. It's a very important question. I know, of course, if you're working in that milieu, it's, these kinds of clients present all the time, and the intention and the awareness of the possibility of re-traumatization is important. I say that's the first step, is to be aware that many people who are in that place just really need a sympathetic listener at first, and not to get too ambitious as the therapist. They may need, stabilization with medications, and there's nothing. Sometimes people get the idea that in NARM we're against medication. That's not the case. For some people, it's essential and helpful. So without, again, having the details of this particular, or a specific example of this, it's hard for me to generalize much more than I've done. But I do appreciate the intention and the awareness that re-traumatization can be possible.
Okay, and the last question, Larry, from Nuala, also wondering about the SE idea of completions. Do you think there's a way completions occur with developmental trauma?
Again, the focus in NARM is more on emotional completion than biological completion, but you can't really separate those. So that as emotional completion takes place, it does affect us on a biological level. It can't help but, because we're, ultimately we're all one piece. And it's just that we don't use conscious re-regulation as part of the NARM, tools, because often what I've seen with shock trauma therapists is that when a client is struggling with a difficult emotion, the therapist will try to regulate these difficult emotions away. And in NARM, we're supporting and we have confidence in our client's ability to deal with the difficult emotions that they may be grappling with. And so, again, in brief, that's an important distinction that we want to really focus on. Emotional completion and the biological completion piece comes with that, and the anchoring of any kind of increased connection, increased capacity in bodily experience is an important piece of the NARM work, and that's where the re-regulation will happen as whatever positive shift the person is experiencing on an emotional level or a cognitive level or a behavioral level, as those shifts, those positive shifts get anchored in bodily experience. And that's the way we support that biological re-regulation piece in NARM.
There's one last question after coming in there, and this will be the last question. Okay. Would be interested in your view how children's increasing use and time spent on screen devices are affecting their neurodevelopment in terms of their ability to self-regulate and have authentic social experiences.
Well, I'm assuming that the person who's writing this question has a perspective on that, and I think it's a perspective that I would share. I don't think that, you know, I think that it's this kind of time spent should be limited, particularly depending on the age of the child, and that ultimately it does take children away from more social engagement if they spend too much time on these little screens. And so I think I would answer in the affirmative to what I'm assuming is the point of view of the person asking the question, that, yeah, I think if we're parents or, you know, we're counseling parents, that we might encourage them to, in some ways, limit the exposure as much as we can to of children to the small screen.
Okay, so we're on the time. Thank you, Larry. It was brilliant.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm really looking forward to the 7th and 8th.
Yeah, I am as well. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank everybody. And if anybody wants to book for the 7th and 8th of March, you can book directly on www.pcpsi.ie. And we'll have a great 2 days.
I look forward to it.
See you then, and thanks everyone for joining.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.